The morning began like any other, a quiet, unremarkable stretch of time that should have slipped gently into memory and disappeared without consequence. The streets of Charleston still carried the softness of dawn, wrapped in a thin mist that drifted low along the sidewalks. The city stirred slowly, as if waking from an old dream, its air thick with salt from the harbor and the faint hum of gulls calling out over distant waves. Levi Jackson adjusted the brim of his worn cap as he stepped out of his townhouse, a weathered building whose red brick had seen both hurricanes and history. His wife, Clara, followed close beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The two moved in quiet rhythm, the kind of synchronicity that only comes from half a century of walking through life together. Levi was 79, his back still straight despite the ache that sometimes crept up from his knees. Clara, 76, carried herself with that blend of grace and endurance that the world often mistakes for fragility. She was anything but fragile. Her fingers, soft but steady, held onto the strap of a canvas shopping bag, while Levi carried another at his side. They were on their way to the local market, 3 blocks down, to buy the week's groceries, a ritual as steady as the sunrise. The neighborhood was still half asleep. Ancient oak trees lined the cracked pavement, their roots pushing up through the concrete, as if reminding the city that nature had been here first. Spanish moss hung from the branches like gentle ghosts, swaying with the rhythm of the coastal breeze. The scent of warm earth and sea salt mingled in the air. A paperboy on a bicycle sped past, calling out, "Morning, Mr. Jackson." A mail carrier nodded from the next block over. The couple waved back, smiles soft but genuine. This was their Charleston, a city that had known storms, both in weather and in history, and still found a way to settle into calm again. Levi and Clara had lived through those storms too. They knew the value of peace and how fragile it could be. That morning, they didn't rush. At their age, there was no need to. They walked at a pace set by patience, not by time. By the time they reached the market, the sun had begun to filter through the moss, turning each strand into a shimmer of gold. They bought apples, onions, and a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. Clara tucked a jar of local honey into her bag, something she always did for the tea, she would say with a smile that Levi never tired of. It was on the way home that the rhythm shifted. The sound came first, a low, deliberate rumble of an engine idling too long. Not the casual hum of a neighbor's car, but the kind of sound that feels like it's waiting for something. Levi turned his head slightly. At the corner, a black and white patrol car sat with its lights off, windows rolled down. The officers inside weren't familiar faces. This car wasn't one of the usual ones that patrol their neighborhood. It gleamed too much, too new, like a visitor who hadn't yet learned the language of the place. Clara's hand tightened just slightly on Levi's arm. He felt it too. Not fear, exactly, something older, heavier. A flicker of memory, buried deep but never erased. He remembered other mornings long ago, when uniforms meant something different, when suspicion came before explanation, and protection was a privilege reserved for others. He'd seen this kind of silence before, the dangerous kind that fills the air before someone decides to speak in a tone that changes everything. They kept walking, slowly, carefully, because both of them knew that sudden movements, no matter how innocent, had a way of being misunderstood. Then the voice came, flat, sharp, heavy with something unspoken. "Sir, ma'am, stop right there." They stopped. Levi turned first, his movements deliberate, slow enough to give the moment no reason to break. The officer stepped out of the car, a man in his 30s, square jaw tight enough to crack glass, hand resting near his belt, not on the gun, but close enough for everyone to know it was there. His mirrored sunglasses caught the rising sun, reflecting the couple back at themselves. 2 aging figures frozen on the sidewalk, grocery bags in hand. The second officer climbed out on the passenger side, younger, barely more than a rookie. His nervousness showed in the way his fingers brushed the edge of his badge like he was reminding himself what it meant. "We got a report," the older one said, his tone clipped and rehearsed. "Someone matching your description, carrying a weapon." For a moment, Levi said nothing. The air thickened, heavy as wet cloth. He looked down at the bags in his hands, lifted one slightly so that the apples inside shifted and knocked together with a hollow, harmless thud. "You mean these?" he asked, his voice calm and low. Clara glanced between them, her hand gripping the loaf of bread as if it could somehow tether them back to the ordinary. The younger officer muttered, almost under his breath, "It's probably nothing." But the older one didn't move. His expression stayed locked, unreadable. "Put the bags down," he said. "Step back. Hands where I can see them." It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Not as a request, as a verdict. Clara's breath caught, a small tremor she couldn't stop. Levi bent down slowly, his knees creaking as he set the bags on the cracked sidewalk. He straightened his back and lifted his hands. For a second, no one moved. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came the click of the cuffs, too fast, too practiced. Cold steel against sun-warmed skin. Levi's wrists were yanked backward with a motion that didn't care who he was, only what he looked like. Clara gasped, a sound half between pain and disbelief. "Please," she started, but the words died in her throat. The younger officer hesitated. For the first time, his eyes met hers, and in that instant, something shifted in him, a crack in the armor of protocol. But doubt doesn't stop the script once it's begun. From the nearby houses, doors opened. Neighbors stepped onto porches. Some whispered. Some raised their phones, uncertain. The Spanish moss drifted lazily above, soft and indifferent, as if the world refused to look away, yet refused to interfere. Within minutes, Levi and Clara were seated in the back of the cruiser. Their groceries lay scattered on the sidewalk, apples rolling toward the gutter, the loaf of bread resting by the curb like a fragile casualty. Inside the patrol car, silence pressed down between them. The hum of the engine drowned out the sounds of the neighborhood. Levi didn't speak. Clara didn't cry. Their silence wasn't surrender, it was survival. They had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the only language left when the world refused to listen. For Levi, the moment felt achingly familiar. The sharpness of being judged without words, the humiliation of being handled like an object instead of a man. For Clara, it was a return to a kind of pain she had spent decades fighting against. The pain of watching dignity stripped away in public. The pain of being forced to remain calm so as not to give anyone an excuse to say you deserved it. The car drove on. The reflection of Charleston's oak-lined streets slid across the window like a moving painting. Levi's eyes stayed fixed on the world outside, a world he'd fought for, a country he'd served 31 years to protect. And now, here he was, hands bound, accused of something he didn't even understand. They reached the station just after sunrise. The building's beige walls and fluorescent lights hummed with that sterile quiet meant to pacify, but it only deepened the chill. The officers led them inside, their cuffs removed with a casualness that stung more than the restraint itself. They were placed in a holding cell, small, square, and cold not because of the air, but because of what it represented. The silence was thicker there, more deliberate, designed to erase the individuality of anyone inside. Levi sat on a bench against the wall, his back straight, his knees aching from the earlier strain. Across from him, Clara sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her breathing had slowed, but the tremor in her chest hadn't fully left. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. They had long ago mastered the art of communicating through silence. Every breath, every look between them carried the weight of shared history. Marches, losses, victories that the world had quickly forgotten. It wasn't fear that filled the room now. It was disbelief, old, familiar disbelief. The kind that settles in the bones of people who have seen too much and still can't quite understand why things keep happening the same way. Clara watched Levi's face. His jaw was firm, his gaze steady on the scuffed tile floor. She knew that look. She had seen it decades ago when he returned from his second tour in Vietnam. Not wounded from combat, but from the welcome he received. Cold eyes, muttered slurs, the sting of a nation that couldn't see past his skin even when he wore its uniform. Back then, she had told him, "You don't have to shout to be heard, Levi. You just have to outlast the noise. He had carried those words ever since, like armor. For a long time, the only sound in the cell was the soft buzz of a fluorescent light overhead. Then, from beyond the steel door, came a faint murmur, a deputy's voice, clipped and uneasy, followed by another, lower one. Then, a woman's voice rose, sharp and certain. I saw it all. I have it on video. You can't bury this. The words slipped into the room like smoke through a crack in the wall. Faint but undeniable. Clara's eyes met Levi's. She didn't smile, but there was something new there, a spark, a glimmer of recognition. For once, someone else had spoken when they couldn't. Minutes later, the door opened. The younger deputy, the one whose eyes had faltered earlier, stepped inside. His face was pale now, his expression brittle. He hesitated before speaking. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, he began, voice low, almost breaking. There's a video. Someone across the street filmed everything. He swallowed hard. It's spreading fast. People are saying you were targeted, that you were hurt. They're asking questions. Levi didn't answer right away. He lifted his gaze, meeting the deputy's eyes with a calmness that felt heavier than anger. Are they listening? He asked quietly. The young man hesitated, then nodded once. They're watching. That was enough. Levi leaned back against the bench, exhaling slowly. The tide had begun to turn. By the time they were led out of the holding cell, the energy in the station had changed. Phones rang nonstop. Voices rose and fell with urgency. Deputies spoke in hurried tones, glancing toward windows where sunlight now streamed through. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, church members, strangers. Some held signs scrawled with uneven letters. We know them. Do you? The sheriff, a broad man named Alan Dean, met Levi and Clara in a briefing room. His expression carried the practiced calm of bureaucracy. There appears to have been a misunderstanding, he said smoothly, his words meant to pacify, not to confess. Levi leaned forward, his voice low but unflinching. This isn't a misunderstanding, Sheriff. This is a pattern. And patterns don't break just because someone calls them by another name. Before Dean could respond, the door opened. A woman entered, Brenda Lattimore, their neighbor, the one who had filmed it all. She wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. She simply set her phone on the table, screen glowing, paused on the frame of Levi kneeling on the cracked asphalt, Clara's hand reaching out toward him. You need to see this, she said, her voice steady. And you need to understand, people have already seen it. You can't undo what's out there. Dean's composure wavered, but Levi and Clara didn't look at him. They looked at Brenda, the woman who refused to look away. Clara spoke softly, her voice steady as stone. Thank you, she said. Not for filming, for not looking away. The younger deputy, Elrod, stepped forward. His voice trembled slightly. Sir, he said to Levi, I should have said something. I knew it didn't feel right. Levi's reply was quiet, deliberate. Then say it now. To them. To anyone who'll listen. That's how this stops. Outside, the murmurs of the crowd had grown into something steady. Not shouts, not chaos, just presence. The church bells of St. Philip's began to ring, their echo carrying across the cobblestone streets like a benediction. When the sheriff finally opened the station doors, sunlight flooded in. The crowd turned, faces calm but resolute, their silence louder than any chant. Levi and Clara stepped forward side by side. Her hand found his, fingers curling around his with a quiet strength that had carried them through every storm. For the first time that morning, he let his shoulders drop. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The city was watching. And for once, it was listening. The Charleston holding cell was colder than the morning outside. Not because of the air conditioning, but because of what the walls were built to hold. The pale beige paint, meant to calm, instead carried the sterile chill of a place where humanity was an afterthought. Every sound, the scrape of a boot in the hallway, the clang of a door shutting somewhere far off, hung in the air too long, echoing like reminders that dignity could be erased one routine act at a time. Levi sat on the hard bench, his back pressed straight against the wall. The stiffness in his knees throbbed where they'd forced him down on the asphalt. Across from him, Clara sat on another bench, her hands folded in her lap, knuckles white against her dark skin. She wasn't trembling anymore, but her chest still burned from the humiliation, from how fast it had all unfolded. The cuffs, the accusation, the eyes watching from behind cell bars that pretended to be mirrors. They had spoken no words since the door closed. Not because they didn't have anything to say, but because after a lifetime of being told to mind their tone, they had learned that silence was sometimes the only thing left that couldn't be twisted against you. For them, quiet was not fear. It was preservation. It was a space where their pride could still breathe. Clara's gaze lingered on her husband. His jaw was locked, his expression still, but his eyes stayed fixed on the scuffed tile floor, as if he were searching for something buried beneath it. An answer, perhaps, or a way to anchor his thoughts before anger could take hold. She had seen that look before. Decades earlier, when he'd returned from Vietnam, bruised not from the battlefield, but from a reception that greeted him at home. She remembered the spit on his uniform, the cold faces that couldn't see the soldier, only the color of the skin that wore the medals. He hadn't spoken for days after that. Back then, she had told him softly, "You don't have to shout to be heard, Levi. You just have to outlast the noise." He had carried those words for the rest of his life, like a creed. Now, in that small, silent room, they both clung to the memory. The hum of the fluorescent light overhead filled the stillness, steady and impersonal. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was impossible to tell. The clock above the door had stopped ticking at some forgotten time. Then came the faint sound of a phone buzzing beyond the steel door. A deputy's muffled voice answered, tone quick and uneasy. Another voice followed, sharper, female. "I saw it all. I have it on video." The sentence cut through the walls like a blade of light slipping through a crack. "You can't bury this." Clara looked up, her eyes meeting Levi's. For a moment, the years melted away. The marches, the threats, the quiet defiance that had become the rhythm of their lives. She didn't smile, but her eyes glinted with recognition. For all the years they had spent fighting in silence, maybe this time someone else had decided to speak. The door opened with a metallic groan. Deputy Aaron Elrod, the younger one from the arrest, stepped in. His face was pale, his shoulders tight, the swagger of the badge gone. He couldn't meet their eyes at first. He cleared his throat, voice unsteady. "Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, there's a video." Someone across the street filmed everything. He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "It's spreading fast. People are saying you were targeted, that you were hurt." He swallowed hard. "They're asking questions." Levi didn't move. He let the silence stretch until it became something the young man had to feel. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm. "Are they listening?" Elrod's eyes flickered up. "They're watching," he said quietly. That was enough. Levi nodded once, slow and deliberate. He didn't look triumphant, just tired, the kind of tired that comes from realizing the truth is no longer something you have to convince anyone of. Within the hour, they were escorted from the cell. The shift in the building was unmistakable. Phones rang in every office. The murmur of officers carried tension instead of authority. From the hallway, Levi could hear snippets of conversation, words like media, footage, and press outside. Through the glass doors of a sheriff's office, the world had changed. Outside, a small crowd was gathering. Neighbors, friends, even strangers, people who had seen the video before breakfast and couldn't look away. A handful held handmade signs, scrawled and rushed, uneven letters. Asterisk, we know them. Asterisk, do you? It wasn't a protest yet. It was a presence. A hum of quiet outrage. Sheriff Alan Dean waited in the briefing room. A broad-shouldered man whose starched uniform seemed to hold him together more than pride did. His brow was furrowed, his jaw set in the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to speak without saying anything. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding," he began smoothly. "We received a report." Levi's voice cut through before he could finish. Calm, controlled, sharp as glass. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Sheriff. This is a pattern. And patterns don't break because someone calls them by another name." The sheriff's mouth tightened, but before he could reply, the door opened again. A woman stepped in. Brenda Lattimore, their neighbor. Her phone was in her hand, its screen already glowing. She didn't need to raise her voice. The room tilted toward her presence. "I thought you'd want to see this," she said simply. She placed the phone on the table, the screen facing the sheriff. On it, a frozen image of Levi kneeling on the cracked sidewalk, the cuffs biting into his wrists, the apples spilled like scattered witnesses across the pavement. She pressed play. The room filled with the sound of Clara's trembling voice, the metallic click of handcuffs, the sharp command of the officer's tone. Brenda paused the video at the moment Clara reached toward Levi, her hand half raised, her eyes wide, the universal gesture of someone begging the world not to look away. "You can't undo this," she said quietly. "People have already seen it." Dean's composure cracked for the briefest second. The practiced calm slipped, replaced by something closer to fear. Clara's gaze moved from Brenda to the sheriff. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not for filming, for not looking away." Her voice carried more weight than any badge in the room. Deputy Elrod shifted uneasily. He stepped closer to Levi and spoke, voice low, hesitant. "Sir, I should have said something. I knew it didn't feel right." Levi turned his head toward him, his face unreadable. "Then say it now," he replied. "To them. To anyone who will listen. That's how this stops." Elrod nodded slowly. Shame sat heavy in his chest, but there was something else too. Resolve. Outside, the hum of the crowd had grown. No shouting, no chaos, just presence. Dozens of voices blending into one steady rhythm of waiting. Church bells began to chime from St. Philip's across the street. Their echo rolled through the air, solemn and clear, as if the city itself were taking a breath. Sheriff Dean straightened his collar, clearing his throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Jackson," he began again, but this time, even he seemed unsure of his own authority. "We're reviewing the situation." Levi didn't respond. His silence was louder than any accusation. Moments later, the doors opened. The sunlight flooded into the station, slicing through the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. Levi and Clara stepped forward. Cameras clicked in the distance. A child's voice called their names softly, as if afraid to disturb the moment. The couple paused at the threshold. Clara's hand found Levi's again, fingers curling around his. For the first time since the cuffs had closed, he let his shoulders ease. They walked into the light together. The crowd parted without a word. No one cheered. No one clapped. But in the silence that followed, there was something undeniable, a collective breath, a shift in the air that said, "Asterisk, we saw it. We won't unsee it. Asterisk." As they stepped onto the sidewalk, the faint breeze carried the scent of magnolia and salt. The groceries they dropped hours earlier were gone now, but the imprint of the moment lingered. The cracked concrete where the apples had rolled might as well have been carved into the city's conscience. That evening, Charleston hummed with a quiet tension. The video Brenda had filmed spread across social media like sparks catching dry grass. Local news anchors replayed it on loop, their voices carefully measured as they spoke of an incident under review. But the footage spoke for itself. Levi's steady composure, Clara's trembling question, the officer's dismissive tone. Each replay carried a different kind of silence, one filled not with shock, but with recognition. For countless people watching, it wasn't the first time they had seen a story like this. Only the faces changed. The city changed. The outcome rarely did. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the age in Levi's eyes, the weight of decades behind that calm. Maybe it was Clara's quiet strength, her refusal to bow under humiliation. Maybe it was the simple, terrible familiarity of two elders being treated like suspects on their own street. Whatever it was, the video struck a nerve. By nightfall, community groups had organized vigils. Journalists called for statements. The department released a line about cooperation and review. But in the Jackson small kitchen, the noise outside barely reached. They sat opposite each other at their old oak table, the ceiling fan turning lazily above them. The blinds were half-drawn. A cup of tea cooled between them, untouched. Levi's military ID lay on the table beside his wallet, the edges frayed, the lamination yellowed. The photograph inside, him in uniform, young and steady, stared back like a memory that refused to fade. 31 years serving this country, he murmured, half to himself. And I'm still just another suspect on my own street. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his. Her voice was quiet but resolute. You were never just another suspect, Levi. They know that now. And if they don't, they're about to. She spoke without trembling, her tone carrying the calm of someone who had marched through fear too many times to be shaken by it anymore. She thought of Montgomery, of Birmingham, of the faces she had seen over the decades. Faces that had believed the same promise, that someday the world would listen. Outside, the faint hum of a car engine broke through the night air. Levi's head turned toward the window. Two black SUVs idled by the curb, their engines purring low and deliberate. Not police. Federal. The doorbell rang once. Within minutes, two agents sat across from them. One tall and lean, the other shorter, broad-shouldered, both dressed in dark suits that seemed to absorb the light. Mr. Jackson, Mrs. Jackson. The taller one began, his tone even. I'm Special Agent Donovan Reeves. This is Agent Elena Marquez, Department of Justice. He set a manila folder on the table between them. What happened to you today, Reeves continued, wasn't just an unlawful arrest. It compromised an ongoing federal investigation. For 6 months, you've been quietly helping us document misconduct across 3 counties. That arrest, it jeopardized everything. Clara's brow furrowed. We didn't ask for this, she said softly, though her voice carried steel beneath the words. We didn't ask to become anyone's evidence. Marquez leaned forward, her gaze steady. We know, but you agreed to help because you believed, even after everything you've seen, that the truth still matters. She looked at Levi directly. Now it's out there, whether we wanted it or not. The question is, what do we do with it? Levi's silence was deliberate. He sat back, thinking of the neighbors standing outside the station earlier, of the quiet crowd holding signs that simply said, "We know them." He thought of Elrod's trembling apology, of Brenda's video, of the sheriff's faltering tone. Finally, he spoke. What happens, he asked, if we push back? What happens if we make them answer for every man and woman they've done this to before us? Reeves didn't flinch. Then it gets dangerous, he said plainly. They'll dig into your past, your service record. They'll twist the story. They'll say you provoked it. They'll say you're angry. They'll say you don't represent anyone but yourselves. Clara's spine straightened. Let them try, she said. I've buried too many friends, marched too many miles, and watched too many mothers cry to sit quiet now. If they think 2 old folks can't make noise, they're in for a surprise. A faint, genuine respect crossed Marquez's face. Then we'll make sure you're protected, she said. But understand this. This isn't just about Charleston anymore. You're not witnesses. You're the case now. And people are watching. The room fell silent again, filled with the low hum of the ceiling fan and the distant chirp of cicadas outside. Levi reached for Clara's hand under the table, his fingers rough and warm. You ready for that? He asked quietly. She squeezed back, eyes steady. I've been ready all my life. Outside, the cicadas sang on, the same rhythm they'd carried for generations. Steady, relentless, refusing to be silenced. And for the first time that day, Levi allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Because this time, the noise belonged to them. Charleston's night air hung heavy, the kind that clung to the skin like a whisper that wouldn't leave. In the Jackson home, the lights were low, the television dark. The silence was not the same kind they had carried all their lives. It was heavier now, charged with the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. Somewhere beyond their window, the world had begun to watch them. Levi sat at the kitchen table, his weathered hands folded around a chipped mug of tea gone cold. Across from him, Clara traced slow circles on the wood grain with one finger. The ceiling fan hummed above them, stirring air thick with the scent of old magnolia and memory. The video, Brenda Lattimore's footage, had already gone viral. It was everywhere now, on phones, on televisions, in inboxes, in newsrooms. Levi's calm, unflinching face as the cuffs locked. Clara's trembling question, why? The officer's flat voice, the hand on the holster, the apples rolling across the concrete. People didn't scroll past this one. Something about it was too raw, too familiar. The silence in it spoke louder than any protest could. Local news stations replayed it again and again, their anchors' voices caught somewhere between outrage and restraint. Talk shows debated it, church leaders prayed over it, and strangers whispered their names like a quiet confession. But inside that small kitchen, the world still felt painfully small. Levi hadn't moved for almost an hour. His military ID lay on the table beside him, its edges frayed, its photo faded but defiant. The young man in the picture wore the same calm expression, only without the years of exhaustion that time had etched into him. 31 years serving this country, Levi murmured, almost to himself, and somehow I'm still a suspect on my own street. Clara's gaze lifted, her eyes tired but steady. You were never just another suspect, Levi. They know that now. And if they don't, she paused, her voice sharpening with quiet conviction, they're about to. Her calm wasn't resignation. It was resolve, the kind born in women who had stood on courthouse steps long before hashtags existed, who had faced batons and fire hoses and somehow never lost their composure. Rage burns out quickly, resolve endures. The stillness broke with the low hum of an engine outside. Levi stood slowly and pulled the blind aside. Two black SUVs idled by the curb, their headlights off, their engines too steady to be local. The men who stepped out didn't move like police. Their suits were tailored, their posture deliberate. Levi's voice was low. Federal. Clara came to stand beside him, resting a hand on his arm. Then it's bigger than we thought. Minutes later, their doorbell rang once. Firm, precise, not the uncertain knock of a neighbor. When Levi opened it, two figures stood framed against the porch light. A tall man with gray at his temples and a lean face, and a woman with dark eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Both wore the quiet authority of people who spoke only when necessary. Mr. Jackson, Mrs. Jackson, the man said, his tone steady. I'm Special Agent Donovan Reeves. This is Agent Elena Marquez, Department of Justice. They stepped inside, removing nothing, not coats, not caution. Clara motioned to the table. You'd better sit then, she said softly, though her voice carried the weight of command. Reeves set a manila folder on the table between them. The sound it made, paper against wood, seemed impossibly loud. What happened to you today, Reeves began, wasn't just a wrongful arrest. It compromised an ongoing federal investigation. Levi's brow furrowed. He didn't speak. For 6 months, Reeves continued, you've been quietly helping us document misconduct and corruption across 3 counties. What happened today, what those officers did, jeopardized the entire operation. Someone recognized you. Clara's fingers tightened around each other. We didn't ask for this, she said softly, though the iron in her voice betrayed the tremor underneath. We didn't ask to become anyone's evidence. Agent Marquez leaned forward slightly, her expression calm but unwavering. We know. You helped because you believed it still mattered, that the truth still counted for something. She met Clara's gaze. Now it's out there, whether we wanted it or not. And the question is, what do we do with it? Levi looked at her, his face unreadable. The lamplight caught the deep lines around his mouth, the quiet steadiness that had carried him through wars and marches and decades of trying to be seen as a man before being judged as anything else. He thought of the crowd outside the station earlier. Neighbors, churchgoers, strangers, standing in silence with homemade signs. He thought of Brenda, her phone trembling as she recorded. He thought of the young deputy whose eyes had faltered when conscience finally outweighed protocol. What happens if we push? He asked finally. What happens if we don't just survive this, but make them answer for everyone they've done this to before us? Reeves didn't blink. Then it gets dangerous, he said plainly. They'll dig into your life, your past. They'll question your service, your motives. They'll say you provoked it, that you were angry, that you don't represent anyone but yourselves. Clara straightened her chair, her spine a line of unbroken resolve. Let them try, she said. I've buried too many friends, marched too many miles, and watched too many mothers cry to sit quiet now. If they think 2 old folks can't make noise, they're in for a surprise. Marquez's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but carried the warmth of respect. Then we'll make sure you're protected, she said. But you need to understand, this isn't just about Russ Creek or Charleston anymore. You're not just witnesses. You're the case now. And people are watching. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of stillness that comes right before the air shifts, the moment before history decides which way it will turn. When the agents left, the night seemed thicker than before. The hum of the SUVs faded into the distance, leaving behind the faint echo of purpose. On the porch, Levi and Clara stood side by side. The cicadas sang in the trees, their rhythm endless, eternal. Levi's gaze followed the red taillights until they vanished into the dark. "I'm tired, Clara," he said quietly. "Not of fighting, just tired of proving over and over who we are." She slipped her hand into his, her fingers rough with age, but strong. "Then this time, Levi," she said softly, "we don't prove. We make them remember." He nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the empty street. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The neighborhood slept, but it was not the same sleep as before. The world was awake now. They went back inside. Levi locked the door, not out of fear, but out of habit. As the bolt slid into place, a thought lingered in the quiet between them, an understanding too deep for words. The cracks in the system had been exposed, and there was no turning back. By morning, Charleston was no longer still. It started with folding chairs, one, then another, lined up in front of the police station. Within hours, dozens of people filled the street. By evening, nearly 100 sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the building's glass doors like they were waiting for it to breathe. They didn't chant. They didn't march. Their stillness was their message. Reporters gathered at the edges, unsure how to cover a protest that didn't make noise. The silence unsettled them. It demanded attention in a way shouting never could. Clara Jackson stood among the crowd, her back straight despite the ache in her knees. She wore the same light blue cardigan she'd worn that morning when she was arrested. Her hands were clasped gently in front of her, and her eyes were calm, unflinching. She hadn't stood in a protest line for years, not since Montgomery in the late 60s. Back then, she and other women had locked arms outside a courthouse, their hymns drowned out by the jeers of those who wanted them gone. Time had aged her, but not her conviction. As she looked around now, at the mix of young faces and old, at students sitting beside veterans, at mothers balancing toddlers on their laps, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope, fragile but real. A young woman nearby, barely 20, held her phone in her lap but didn't record. She was simply watching, her eyes wide and reverent. Clara gave her a small nod, the kind that says, "This is bigger than us, but we're here together." Inside the station, Sheriff Alan Dean watched from his office window. His reflection blurred in the glass, making him look smaller somehow, less certain. Behind him, Deputy Elrod stood stiff, the air between them thick with unspoken reckoning. "They're not leaving, sir," Elrod said softly. Dean's hand gripped the blinds. "They never do," he muttered. Then he let the blinds snap shut. He had seen protests before, angry ones, loud ones, but this was different. This wasn't a storm that could be waited out. It was a tide that moved too quietly to stop. By mid-afternoon, the street was lined with news vans. Their antennas reached into the gray sky like impatient fingers. Cameras rolled as more people arrived, veterans in worn jackets, pastors in black coats, teenagers with hand-painted signs. One sign read, "Respect is not optional." The words, uneven and smudged, carried more weight than their ink. Levi hadn't wanted to come. "We've done our part," he'd said that morning. But Clara had insisted. "They need to see us," she told him. "Not just the video, us." And so they came, walking slowly down the cracked sidewalk, side by side, their pace steady. When people saw them, the murmurs died down. No one cheered. No one clapped. The crowd simply parted, creating a path as natural as breath. The two of them reached the front line of chairs, and Clara sat with the grace of a queen, taking her place on a throne she never asked for. Levi remained standing for a moment, scanning the crowd. His eyes moved from the faces outside to the glass doors of the station, where officers stood watching. Behind that glass, he saw his own reflection, the same man who had been forced to his knees on that very sidewalk days ago. Then, with slow, deliberate movement, he sat beside his wife. From the doorway, Elrod watched them. The image of Levi in the back of the cruiser flickered through his mind. The man's steady breath, the quiet dignity that had haunted him ever since. He swallowed hard. "Feels like we owe them something," he murmured to no one in particular. The receptionist at the front desk, Caroline, heard him but didn't answer. She was watching the crowd, her eyes resting on Clara. For a moment, she felt something shift inside her. Not guilt, not pity, but gravity, the sense of witnessing a moment that could not be undone. As dusk fell, a rhythmic sound cut through the air, the sharp, deliberate click of shoes on pavement. The murmurs stilled. Reverend Holloway had arrived. He was older now, his once black hair streaked with gray, but his presence still carried the quiet weight of a man who had marched beside giants. He walked to the front, his Bible tucked under one arm, his other hand resting on the shoulder of a teenage boy. Without ceremony, he joined the first row, nodding once to Levi and Clara before sitting down. That simple act, the Reverend choosing not to lead but to sit, shifted the air. It reminded everyone present that there was power in stillness, in solidarity, in refusing to move until justice did. By nightfall, the street glowed in the soft orange of streetlights. The windows of the station reflected the faces of those who waited. Inside, Sheriff Dean closed his office door. The sound echoed faintly down the hall, swallowed by the silence outside. On the front line, Clara reached for Levi's hand. Her voice was barely a whisper. "This time," she said, "we're not walking away." Levi turned to her, his expression calm, resolute. "No," he said, "not this time." Around them, the city held its breath. And for the first time since that morning when the world had turned against them, Charleston wasn't just watching. It was listening. The morning after the silent protest, Charleston awoke to a stillness that wasn't peace, but something heavier, an anticipation. The streets that usually echoed with chatter from tourists and the hum of passing cars now seemed to hold their breath. Something in the air had shifted. Across from the Charleston Police Department, the folding chairs remained lined in neat rows, empty for the moment, but waiting. They had been placed there by neighbors, by church members, by strangers who felt compelled to show up even if they didn't yet know what to say. The chairs were quiet, but they spoke. By noon, the seats began to fill again. First came the early risers, the elderly from the church down the street, men and women who had seen this kind of fight before. Then came the students, some carrying backpacks, some holding small cardboard signs painted hastily in dorm rooms. By the end of the hour, nearly 100 people sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces calm, their eyes fixed on the glass doors of the police station. They didn't shout. They didn't move. Their presence was the protest. The silence was more powerful than noise. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was sound turned inward, a hum of endurance that pressed against the heart of the city. Clara Jackson stood at the center of the front row, her blue cardigan folded neatly over her shoulders. Her posture was firm despite the ache that had settled in her knees. She had not stood like this in decades, not since the days when she and other women locked arms outside the Montgomery courthouse and dared men twice their size to look them in the eye. Now, half a century later, she found herself doing it again, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. As she scanned the crowd, she saw faces that spanned generations. Veterans wearing faded service caps, young mothers balancing toddlers on their hips, teenagers who looked too young to carry so much awareness in their eyes. And then she saw a girl, no more than 20, holding a phone in her hand but not recording, just watching. Clara offered her a small, knowing nod. It was the kind of gesture that said, "Asterisk, you don't have to film this to prove it happened. Just remember what you saw." Asterisk. The sun hung high, sharp and unflinching. The heat rolled off the asphalt in shimmering waves, but no one moved. Even the air seemed to respect the moment. Inside the police station, Sheriff Alan Dean stood by his office window, watching the crowd below. His reflection merged with the scene outside, a ghostly overlay that made him look uncertain. like a man caught between two worlds. Behind him, Deputy Elrod lingered near the doorway. His posture was tense, his voice quiet. "They're not leaving, sir." Dean didn't turn around. His jaw flexed once before he answered. "They never do." He let the blinds fall shut, cutting himself off from view. His shoulders tightened. He had been in law enforcement for 28 years, had seen marches, riots, vigils, but nothing like this. There was no chant to drown out, no slogan to twist. Just silence. And silence, he was learning, couldn't be controlled. By mid-afternoon, the street was lined with news vans. Their antennas reached into the sky like impatient fingers. Reporters spoke in hushed tones, unsure how to frame what they were witnessing. The cameras caught every detail, the rows of still faces, the folded hands, the signs painted with uneven letters. Asterisk, we know them. Do you? Asterisk in respect is not optional. It wasn't chaos. It was order. A quiet declaration that the city itself was on trial. Inside the station, some officers tried to carry on with routine, their radios crackling with empty codes. But every now and then, someone would glance toward the glass doors, and the sight of that waiting crowd would stop them mid-sentence. Deputy Elrod sat at his desk, pen frozen above his paperwork. The image of Levi Jackson, the man's hands cuffed, his face calm, his silence like a mirror, still haunted him. The memory replayed in flashes. Clara's trembling voice, the apples rolling across the pavement, the wordless shock in the eyes of the neighbors who had watched. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "Feels like we owe them something." Caroline from the front desk looked up. She didn't respond, but her eyes softened. She had seen the video, too. Everyone had. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. By early evening, church bells began to toll from St. Philip's. The sound rippled through the air, solemn, resonant, like a city calling itself to account. Then came a sound that sliced through the murmured quiet, the measured, rhythmic click of shoes on the pavement. Heads turned. Reverend Samuel Holloway was approaching, his Bible tucked beneath one arm, his other hand resting on the shoulder of a teenage boy walking beside him. His steps were slow, deliberate, every motion carrying the weight of memory. He had marched in Selma, preached in Montgomery, and buried too many of his own. When he reached the front of the line, he didn't speak. He didn't lift his hand in blessing or call the crowd to prayer. He simply nodded once to Levi and Clara, then pulled a folding chair and sat down beside them. The gesture was small, but it broke something open in the air, a kind of permission, a reminder that power didn't always need a podium. Sometimes it only needed presence. The hum of cameras grew softer, as if the machines themselves were paying respect. Inside his office, Sheriff Dean watched from the shadows. He had kept the blinds closed all afternoon, but curiosity finally betrayed him. He pulled them apart just enough to see the street below. The crowd had doubled, maybe tripled. Rows of faces, calm and unyielding. He saw Clara in her cardigan, Levi beside her, Reverend Holloway just behind them. They weren't shouting, they weren't moving, but their silence filled the air like thunder. Dean let the blinds slip from his fingers. The sound of them snapping shut was sharp in the quiet room. For the first time in his career, he didn't know which side of the story he stood on. Night came slowly, wrapped in a haze of golden light. The street lamps flickered on one by one, casting halos over the rows of chairs. The station's windows reflected the glow, hundreds of faint faces mirrored in the glass, waiting for the building to blink first. A light breeze swept through the street, stirring the corners of the handmade signs and carrying with it the sweet scent of magnolia from a nearby yard. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else hummed a hymn too soft to name. Clara reached for Levi's hand. Her fingers laced through his, her grip warm and steady. "This time," she said quietly, when not walking away. Levi turned to her. The streetlights caught the lines of his face, the tiredness, the strength, the calm that had survived everything. "No," he said, "not this time." Around them, the crowd shifted slightly, not in unrest, but in unity. A woman began to hum, "We shall not be moved." Another joined in, then another. The melody rose, soft at first, then full, carried on the breeze like an echo from another lifetime. Inside, Dean closed his office door with a dull click. The sound rolled down the hall, through the silence, and into the night outside. But outside, no one flinched. They sat and sang, their voices low, deliberate, unyielding. The hymn was older than any one of them, older than the city itself. Clara's voice trembled but didn't break. Levi's joined hers, deep and steady, the sound of endurance made flesh. The song carried beyond the station, beyond the news vans, drifting through the streets and alleys of Charleston. It slipped through open windows and found its way into homes where people sat watching the news, unsure whether to believe what they were seeing. It reached the harbor, where the waves lapped against the docks, and the gulls circled above as if listening. It reached those who had lived this story before, in other towns, other years, other lives. And somewhere, deep inside the walls of the police station, it reached the officers too. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was different. Not empty. Full. Charged with something alive. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle. She could feel the weight of Levi's hand in hers, the pulse of the city around them, the unspoken truth that something irreversible had begun. For years, they had been told to stay calm, stay polite, stay silent. Now, that silence was theirs. They had turned it from survival into resistance, from endurance into testimony. The cameras caught the moment, the old couple sitting side by side, the crowd behind them, the soft glow of streetlights reflecting off the police station windows. It became an image that would live far beyond the city. The power of stillness, the courage of restraint, the unbreakable dignity of two lives that refused to bend. As the night deepened, the crowd began to thin. But many stayed. Church elders with their hymnals, students with their signs, reporters with their cameras running even when they had nothing left to say. Clara and Levi remained seated until the last of the magnolia scent drifted away. When they finally rose, it wasn't out of exhaustion. It was purpose. They turned toward the station one last time, the reflection of their faces shimmering in the glass like twin ghosts of conscience. Levi's voice was soft. "Do you hear that?" Clara tilted her head. The cicadas had started again, the same steady rhythm that filled Charleston nights. "Sounds like the city's awake," she said. Levi nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Then let's keep it that way." They walked home together, the streetlights following them like witnesses, their shadows stretching long behind them. And for the first time since the day it all began, Charleston felt like it was listening. The air inside the Charleston County Courthouse was thick with waiting. It carried the weight of too many stories that had begun like this one, with handcuffs, humiliation, and disbelief. The walls, lined with dark wood and brass plaques, seemed to hold the echoes of a country forever wrestling with itself. Every seat in the chamber was filled, but the faces were not the usual mixture of lawyers, journalists, and officials. They were neighbors, veterans, students, and families, people who had come not for spectacle, but for reckoning. They had seen the video. They had sat in silence outside the police station. And now they were here, not to protest, but to witness. Levi Jackson sat in the second row, his hands folded loosely in his lap. He wore his best gray suit, the same one he had worn to his granddaughter's graduation years ago. The cuffs that had once bruised his wrists had left faint shadows, pale reminders of the morning that had changed everything. Beside him, Clara sat with quiet composure. Her posture was steady, her eyes forward. She wore a simple navy dress and the same cardigan she had worn during the protest. Her hair, carefully pinned back, caught the soft light from the courthouse windows. She didn't fidget. She didn't whisper. She simply waited. For weeks, Charleston had been holding its breath for this day. What began as an arrest on a quiet street had rippled outward until the whole city felt the tremor. The Jacksons had become a symbol, but they never asked to be. They hadn't marched for fame or shouted for vengeance. Their silence had been enough to expose everything. At the front of the chamber, Special Agent Donovan Reeves stood beside his partner, Elena Marquez. They weren't here as saviors. They were here to close a chapter, to name what had been done, and to make sure it was seen for what it was. When Reeves spoke, his voice carried easily through the room. Calm, measured. But beneath the professionalism was something human: respect. The Department of Justice, he began, has concluded its review of the events involving Mr. and Mrs. Jackson. He paused, letting the quiet stretch, the way one does before saying something that can't be taken back. His gaze moved deliberately across the room, to the deputies sitting opposite, to the sheriff's office representatives, and then to the two figures seated behind the defense table. Officer Timmons sat rigid, his jaw locked, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes flicked between the floor and the far wall. Beside him, Deputy Elrod sat upright, but his head was slightly bowed. He had barely spoken since the incident. The shame that had taken root that morning had grown heavy, and he carried it now like armor too tight to remove. Reeves opened the folder before him. "It is the finding of this office," he said, "that excessive force was used without just cause, resulting not only in a violation of civil rights, but in the compromise of an ongoing federal investigation." A low murmur rippled through the benches. The words landed with quiet force. Each syllable felt like a door closing on denial. Reeves continued, "Effective immediately, Officer Timmons is terminated from his position and will face formal charges for civil rights violations." There was no applause, only stillness, the kind that follows truth when it's finally spoken aloud. He turned a page. Deputy Aaron Elrod will be suspended without pay and placed under federal review for failure to intervene. Sheriff Dean's office will remain under DOJ oversight until further notice. The room remained silent, but the silence was no longer the heavy, suffocating kind. It was release, like the first exhale after holding your breath for too long. Clara felt her fingers trembling in her lap. She clasped her hands tighter, grounding herself. She had learned, long ago, that justice often came dressed in ceremony, carefully worded, neatly documented. But this time, something felt different. This wasn't a press release to be forgotten by morning. This was accountability. Reeves closed the folder and looked directly at the Jacksons. His voice softened. "Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, the department thanks you for your cooperation and your restraint. Both of you have served not only this country, but this community with dignity. The acknowledgement of your role as federal witnesses will be formally documented." He reached into the folder and withdrew 2 envelopes. They were unadorned, official, but heavy. He handed them forward. Levi accepted his first, the paper cool beneath his fingers. Clara took hers with quiet reverence. No medals, no speeches, just the truth finally written down. Levi looked at the envelope for a moment, then back at Reeves. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and steady, but carried the gravity of years. "Paper doesn't fix what's broken," he said, "but it can make sure people don't forget." Reeves met his eyes and nodded once. "That's why we're here," he said. When the hearing adjourned, no one moved right away. It was as if everyone in the room needed a moment to absorb what had happened, to understand that they had just witnessed history not in the grand sense, but in the deeply human one. Levi rose slowly, his joints stiff but his posture unbowed. Clara stood beside him, her hand brushing his arm lightly. Together, they turned toward the door. As they walked down the center aisle, people began to rise one by one, not cheering, not clapping, simply standing in quiet respect. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Just once. Then again. The sound spread, soft at first, then stronger, a slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat. Levi paused at the courthouse doors and looked back. The applause wasn't loud. It wasn't for victory. It was for endurance. He turned to Clara, a faint smile flickering at the edge of his lips. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Hope's waiting," she said, using the name of their granddaughter, but also something larger. Outside, the sunlight was sharp, clean. The courthouse steps gleamed white under the afternoon sky. A crowd had gathered beyond the barriers. Neighbors, reporters, strangers who had followed the story from the beginning. When Levi and Clara appeared, the murmur stilled. There were no chants, no banners raised. Only the soft hum of camera shutters clicking and the sound of hands coming together again, slow and deliberate. They stepped into the light, hand in hand, moving with the same measured grace they always had. The applause followed them down the steps, growing steadier, deeper. Levi breathed in the warm air, letting it fill the space that humiliation had once taken. "It's not victory," he murmured, "but it's a start." Clara squeezed his hand. "That's enough," she said. For now, they reached the street. The crowd parted to make room for them, as if the city itself were learning how to give way, to make space for those it had wronged. Behind them, the courthouse stood tall, its steps washed in sunlight, its shadow falling short. For the first time in weeks, Levi felt the tension ease from his shoulders. The noise of cameras, the murmur of reporters, the hum of the city, all faded behind him. What lingered was the sound of footsteps, his and Clara's, moving forward side by side. That evening, Charleston felt different. The city's usual noise, the shouts, the sirens, the endless rhythm of traffic, seemed gentler somehow, as if the streets themselves were exhaling. In homes and cafes, on sidewalks, and church porches, people spoke of the Jacksons. They replayed the footage, not for shock anymore, but for understanding. They watched Levi's silence, Clara's trembling defiance, and saw something that couldn't be unseen. The story had traveled far beyond Charleston now. News anchors spoke their names with reverence. Commentators called it a turning point. But for the Jacksons, it was never about headlines. It was about the simple, stubborn truth that human dignity should never depend on who's watching. At home, the television stayed off. The blinds were half drawn. The world could talk. They preferred quiet. Levi sat at the kitchen table, the two envelopes resting beside his wallet. He hadn't opened his yet. The house was filled with the slow creak of settling wood, the faint hum of cicadas outside. Clara moved about softly, setting tea on the stove, her movements unhurried. There was peace in routine, and after everything, they had earned that peace. "You gonna open it?" she asked, nodding toward the envelope. "Maybe tomorrow," Levi said. "I already know what's inside." She smiled faintly. "You mean the apology?" He shook his head. "No, the record, the proof." Clara sat down across from him, her hands wrapping around her teacup. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how it all started with something so small. Just a walk, a bag of apples, a loaf of bread." Levi nodded slowly. The things that keep us alive are always the things they overlook. Outside, headlights passed across the window, casting fleeting patterns on the walls. The world was moving again, but not the same way. Levi took a long breath, his voice low. "You know what the agent said? They were the case now." Clara met his eyes. "Then let's be the kind that reminds them what right looks like." Her tone was steady, but beneath it was fire, the kind that doesn't fade with age, the kind that only grows more focused. He smiled, the corners of his mouth softening. "You always know what to say." She reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "That's what 50 years of practice gets you." They sat there for a while, in the hush that followed storms. And though neither said it aloud, both knew that their story had stopped being just theirs. It had become a mirror for every person who had ever been silenced, doubted, dismissed. For every generation that had marched, stood still, or whispered truth into the face of power. The next day, newspapers across the country carried the same image. Levi and Clara Jackson standing at the top of the courthouse steps, sunlight washing over them, hands clasped. The headline read, "Asterisk the quiet that changed a city." Asterisk, but headlines fade. Videos get replaced. Hashtags disappear. What didn't fade was what the Jacksons had shown. That silence, when held with purpose, could be louder than rage. That dignity, even under handcuffs, could become its own form of rebellion. And that two elders, walking home with groceries, could shake the foundations of an entire system without ever raising their voices. Weeks later, life began to return to something like normal, though normal had a new meaning now. The chairs outside the police station were gone, but in their place stood a small plaque. In honor of Levi and Clara Jackson, for reminding us that truth begins in the quiet. It wasn't much, but it was something, Every few days, someone left flowers by it. Sometimes fresh fruit, apples mostly, and when Clara passed by on her morning walks, she always smiled. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Charleston, Levi and Clara sat on their porch. The air was soft, touched with the scent of rain from the harbor. The city lights flickered on in the distance. Levi leaned back, his arm resting across the chair beside him. "You think it's over?" he asked. Clara's eyes stayed on the horizon. "No," she said, "but it's beginning." He nodded slowly, the cicadas starting their nightly chorus. For a long while, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence had already said everything.